My name is Elizabeth Sweeney Block. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Chicago Divinity School, pursuing a PhD in religious ethics. And I'm pleased to be speaking today with Professor Charles Curran, Elizabeth Scurlock University Professor of Human Values at Southern Methodist University. Professor Curran is an expert on fundamental moral theology, social ethics, the role of the Catholic Church as a moral and political actor in society, and Catholic moral theology. He's the author of numerous books and articles, including Catholic Moral Theology in the United States, A History, and Loyal Dissent, Memoir of a Catholic Theologian, both published by Georgetown University Press. Thank you, Charlie, for giving the Journal of Religious Ethics your time today. We appreciate it greatly.
Thank you for giving your time, Elizabeth.
I'd like to start our conversation today with some questions about your start in the field of ethics, as well as your role as teacher of ethics. I want to begin by asking you about how you began your pursuit of Christian ethics. In your memoir, Loyal Dissent, you write, and this is a quote, "I had felt no calling to teach and had thus opted for the diocesan priesthood. But now I was told that I was to get a doctoral degree and prepare to teach in the diocesan seminary. I did not choose what was to become my life's work. I simply obeyed an order." So you were told by the auxiliary bishop of Rochester, New York, that this was to be your plan, to pursue a doctorate in moral theology. Could you reflect for us a little bit about that start in ethics? Had you ever felt a kind of calling or felt yourself drawn to ethical reflection and pastoral care, or did you really feel that you were just being told this was what you were to pursue?
No, I think, Elizabeth, there was a receptivity on my part to do it. I had been in Rome as a student in the seminary part of Rome for 3.5 years at that time, and had taken an interest in theology in general, and specifically in moral theology. I had about that time I had read the Italian translation of Bernard Herring's book on the law of Christ. And that definitely whetted my interest in moral theology. So when I got that order, let's say, I was very glad to accept it. In fact, it's interesting. I was teaching a course on a couple sessions on Luther, and I happened to think of that because Luther started out teaching because his religious superior told him to do so.
Right.
A degree, so we're in the same boat.
Right. So overall, you feel it's worked out well for the best. You feel you found your calling in ethics.
I've been very, very pleased and very happy, yes.
Speaking of teaching, you've been a teacher of ethics for many years, and I was wondering if you have a favorite moment or a favorite insight from your experience as a teacher that you would share with us.
Well, I think my teaching has been in different areas, kinds of thing. To be honest with you, I never taught undergraduates until I had been teaching for 25 years, kind of thing.
Oh, okay.
And it was always interesting to compare the difference. I mean, sometimes I am a little worried that graduate students are afraid that they'll betray their ignorance, kind of thing, whereas undergraduates say, no, boom, they'll just, raise some questions here and there. I think once the doctoral students get to know you better, then you have that kind of open dialogue. But in the beginning, at times, I felt there could be that type of reticence because they didn't want to, make a mistake or that kind of thing.
Yeah, so the undergraduates are more fearless.
That's right. Now, I mean, that's a plus. There's some negatives too about that.
Sure. Must make for some interesting.
You know that.
Sure, yes, makes for interesting conversation, to say the least. Turning now to the field of Christian ethics today and changes that you've seen in the field over the years, could you describe for us some of the developments you've experienced in the discipline of Christian ethics in your years as both a teacher and a researcher in the field?
Yes, I think the change has been just huge. Let me go back put it in the framework of the Society of Christian Ethics. I became president of the Society of Christian Ethics in 1971. I
Mm-hmm.
was one of the first Catholics to join in '64. The society had really started around '58. And at that time, it was primarily the Protestant teachers of social ethics in Protestant seminaries. And that was the ethos when I joined. But it also included another element, and that was the social activists from various Protestant denominations all belonged. So it was not that academic a group at the time. In fact, when I became president in 1971, I put on the program something which I'm glad to see they've still continued doing. Namely, we discussed books written by our members. And one of my somewhat curmudgeonly colleagues, when I proposed it, said, "Oh, Charlie, what are we going to have? One book a year kind of thing?" And I said, "Well, let's hope that maybe we can get more coming." So in a certain sense, the society, probably the biggest change has been in terms of the academic nature of the society, that it really was not all that academic. And I think we've made some efforts to make it more academic. In
Mm-hmm.
fact, telling a story on myself, I was put in charge of some committee to redo the requirements for membership. And, I said, "Oh, well, we need a PhD, of course." And I showed it to one of my colleagues, and he said, "Well, Charlie, that's right, but you got to be a little careful, because if you push that, Reinhold Niebuhr and John Coleman Bennett could not be members of this society." So we had to put in equivalency kinds of language. But I think that has been the major development. It's become much more academic. Now, part of that, I think, is due to a number of causes. The fact that there was, especially from the Roman Catholic side, that up until about that time, that the theology courses in Catholic colleges were not very good at all.
Mm-hmm.
They were taught mostly by religious people who didn't have training and so forth. So and even broader than that, the only place you could get a doctorate in Catholic moral theology in the United States before 1960, for all practical purposes, was a pontifical degree at Catholic University.
Mm-hmm.
So you had this huge development occurring from the obviously Vatican Council II had a great effect of that. And as I say, also within the Protestant world, that the original society was heavily social action people. But then, especially in the '70s, when you got public universities to establish departments of religion, and ethics was a part of that, that also was a very important factor in developing a more academic nature of the discipline. In fact, I think 2 years ago, I sort of smiled to myself, because the program for the meeting of the Society of Christian Ethics had 3 different morning sessions of 20 each on books that the people had written. And even then, they couldn't get them all on the program. So I think that's a great indication. Now, the other thing, obviously, is the great increase, not the great increase, the coming of women into the society.
Sure.
And the number has greatly increased since then. But in the very beginning, I think there might have been one woman at the first meeting I went to. And but obviously since then, there's been a tremendous growth in that area as well.
That's helpful, thank you. And I can see and understand your appreciation for the more academic nature of the Society of Christian Ethics now. Could you maybe step back from the Society of Christian Ethics and just consider the discipline of ethics, Christian ethics, maybe even religious ethics more broadly, and describe some of the changes in focus, the particular points of study that have been pursued, and really just consider how the overall field has changed since you've been a member of it?
Yes, I think I'd have to speak primarily in terms of Christian ethics.
Sure.
But I think, again, it's the academic nature of the discipline. I
Okay.
mean, when I started, people tended to do it across the board. You taught all Christian ethics kinds of things. And precisely because there was not that much written in the subject, and what you have had since that time then is the tremendous growth of specialization, specializing in particular areas.
Mm-hmm.
Quite frankly, there are very few people around today who try to, go the whole route and involve the whole area of the discipline. I
Sure.
mean, certainly anybody coming into the discipline today definitely has to specialize in a particular area. But that's all part of that broader picture of the increased academic aspect of the discipline, I think.
Okay. And so, is there anything you would add then if you were to describe Christian ethics today, apart from saying that it's really a diversity of specialties? Is there any particular work you see being done that really characterizes what Christian ethics is about today?
Well, I think it's difficult to speak about one particular work that does this precisely because of the diversity and the
Mm-hmm.
pluralism. But it is part of this same sort of academic trajectory. There's no doubt in my mind that people like you are much better prepared than I was 50 years ago. That there's just no doubt whatsoever about that. And I think that again is part of the same trajectory. But and obviously what I worry about, and the same thing I'm sure that you worry about, Elizabeth, is the job market today. I mean,
Sure.
this is certainly a very unfortunate thing we're facing, and to have so many well-prepared people who have so much to offer, and I just hope that we will be able to find places where they can be employed and do their teaching and research.
I do too.
I'm
I
sure
share
you
your
agree.
concern. Yeah. While we're on the subject of diversity and religious diversity, this interview is, of course, for the Journal of Religious Ethics. And so I'd like to turn just for a minute to the topic of balancing religious diversity and pluralism with religious particularity. You have said, and this is from an article you wrote for the Journal of the Society of Christian Ethics, which was entitled Christian Ethics, Unique and Distinctive Aspects. You had said that there are specifically Christian sources, things like Christian scripture and tradition, but even so, the material content of Christian morality is not necessarily unique. The readership of the Journal of Religious Ethics encompasses, of course, a range of religious believers as well as scholars of religion who have no particular religious affiliation. Could you reflect for a moment on what this kind of diversity and exposure to various traditions means for the field of religious ethics?
Right. I would just qualify what you described as my position. It might have been in those
Sure.
days. I don't know.
Okay, sure.
I was talking more specifically about material content of social norms kinds of things.
Okay, okay.
And I think that has been, borne out in the history of the Journal of Religious Ethics, where we have seen people from different religious perspectives often agreeing and disagreeing on particular social norms.
Mm-hmm.
But it does seem to me that when you look at the subjective side of it, in other words, there's the objective pole of morality are the actions and more so maybe the virtues of the person, but the virtues are also primarily a subjective thing.
Sure.
And it seems to me then in terms of the subjective aspect, which also has an influence on the objective, that is where diversity certainly comes into play.
Mm-hmm.
But there again, it isn't always that great. I mean, certainly the classical example we were thinking of, 50 years ago was Mahatma Gandhi.
Mm-hmm.
And how Gandhi came to many things, positions that certain Christians held in common with him, kind of thing. So I think, again, that this kind of diversity can be a very good thing because it helps to cross-fertilize things, it brings different perspectives in. At the same time, I don't want to deny that there will always be differences and that these differences are also an important part of the mix.
Absolutely. It seems to me there's a challenge today to appreciate what's unique and distinct about unique religions, and at the same time to see what we have in common without sort of watering down the uniqueness or the particularity, and to
It's
find
it's
that balance.
no, it's that age-old tension, and in some ways, it's a mirror, I think, of the tension between the particular and the more universal kind of thing. And
Mm-hmm.
I'm one of these both-and people all the time,
Sure.
wants to hold on to both of those aspects of things,
Yeah.
and so the same way with the diversity and the possibility of agreement.
Our previous discussion about diversity and the subject pole of ethics leads nicely into my next question, which is about the role of experience in the moral life. As a very important source of moral wisdom, how is it that we can appreciate and draw on experience without simply using experience to justify a kind of anything goes mentality or a kind of relativism or individualism?
Well, as I said, we could spend a whole semester on this one. But I think, there are a number of questions that come up here. The first one, obvious one is whose experience? And I mean, everybody's experience is limited, as we all are, and we have to recognize that. But still, it is obviously a very important source. In here, I think I go back to something like the Wesleyan quadrilateral. If you recognize four different sources, scripture, tradition, experience, and reason, then I think you wind up in a somewhat hermeneutic circle that keeps you from absolutizing any one of those. And I think the danger might be, if you do absolutize the experience, that you do wind up in the possibility of relativism, etc. So there's no easy answer, I don't think, to that, except to say you've got to keep the whole hermeneutic circle going, and you have to recognize the limitations of anybody's experience as well as its importance.
Mm-hmm. And so there needs to be just a constant ongoing dialogue among those four sources.
I think that's the only way to uh, try to deal with the issue.
Mm-hmm. Turning maybe a little bit of our attention to the church, in many places you've referred to the pilgrim nature of the church. Do you think that Christian ethicists and church leaders alike need to be more careful about how we use and what we mean by the word church? Are there harmful understandings of the word church that are operative today, for instance?
I think in general that, there are sort of two ways of thinking. I mean, obviously there is the Christian church. And interestingly enough, perhaps one of the areas in Christian ethics that has not been given enough importance is the role of the church. Mm-hmm. And how the church affects in ethics. Long ago, Jim Nelson wrote a book on that, and there has not been as much work done on that as I think there should be. I've tried to do a little bit on it from the Catholic perspective and say, if you believe in a church Catholic, that's going to affect your ethics. Because Catholic by its very nature means it's universal, and it tries to be big kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And therefore you're going to be open to many different sources of moral wisdom and knowledge. You're going to be open to a kind of dialogue with other people. You are going to recognize that many people have to come into the discussion kind of thing. Mm-hmm. So it seems to me that there is an ecclesiological aspect to Christian ethics that has not been developed all that much. I mean, again, reflecting on our own discipline, it seems to me there has always been a tendency in the Protestant tradition to be afraid of synthesis. Mm-hmm. That any kind of synthesis, the danger is you're going to leave something out. Mm-hmm. The danger is you're going to take away the freedom of the believer kind of thing. Mm-hmm. That you're going to construct this understanding which will tend to leave things out. The mm-hmm. Catholic has always been, I think, more interested in trying to develop a synthesis kind of thing. I mean, going back to Thomas Aquinas, frankly, and I think that is a characteristic of the Roman Catholic, but I also think we have to be aware of some of the dangers of that kind of thinking within the Catholic tradition. And that's why when I do talk about it, I like to say it is Catholic with a small c. Mm-hmm. There has to keep it open kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You mentioned the freedom of the believer, and I know that you're a strong supporter of religious liberty and certainly the primacy of conscience, and also at the same time an outspoken critic of the Roman Catholic Church's stance on artificial contraception. Recently, of course, the past year or so, we've seen much in the news about the Health and Human Services mandate, that all employers ought to provide insurance coverage for artificial contraception. Those who oppose that mandate, the U.S. bishops in particular, do so on the grounds that it infringes religious liberty. I was wondering if you would offer your take on this Health and Human Services mandate. Do you view it as a religious liberty issue, as a contraception issue, as an authority issue? Is it possible to come to a resolution of this that is not polarizing?
All of the above issues, and I hope we could arrive at a non-polarizing thing, but I worry about it that we can't, especially in the light of the whole polarization, both in society and in the church. But the way I would look at it is, Elizabeth, is something like this, that yes, I'm a firm believer in the religious liberty and the First Amendment of the Constitution, and we have to respect the religious liberty of all believers and all people. And quite frankly, in the course of history, the people who have always had their religious freedom attacked or denied are minority groups. It's always the minority groups, be it the Mormons back in the 19th century with regard to the practice of polygamy, be it the Mennonites not wanting to send their children to schools, etc. Now, it seems to me, though, in trying to come to grips with this issue today, yes, I'm a strong believer in religious freedom, but there's a distinction that has to be made between religious institutions as such and other types of institutions run by religious groups. Sure. And here I'd be thinking especially then of universities and hospitals, sure, where this issue has come to play. Because not only does the religious freedom of the church institution that sponsors these comes into play, but there's also the freedom and the religious freedom of other people who are involved in them. Namely, these people have employees who are non-Catholic. They have many people they serve are non-Catholic. What about their freedom? What about their rights? So it seems to me that this is precisely an area that calls for some kind of compromise. And that I was pleased at the end that I thought the Obama administration was trying to do that. That you try to work out how can you keep both, give respect to both. I mean, the religious freedom of the church and somewhat even in their church-sponsored institution, but also the human freedom and religious freedom of non-Catholics who work in those institutions and who are serviced by them. And so as a result, I thought they made a bona fide attempt to try to come up with a legitimate compromise. And it reminded me there was in a somewhat similar area, there was a fascinating compromise back, I guess it was 15 years ago. And it was in the city of San Francisco, when the city of San Francisco demanded that any group in the city, organization that was getting funds from the city, had to make sure that that gay partners were given in medical insurance. Mm-hmm. And interestingly enough, the Catholic Archbishop at the time was the man who later became the head of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith in Rome, William Levada. Mm-hmm. And to the credit, Levada and Willie Brown, the mayor, got together and came up with a marvelous compromise. Mm-hmm. Levada said, look, we as Catholics have always wanted to extend as far as possible the right to health care. And therefore, if we can put into the legislation that we would be willing to give benefits to an adult legally living in the same household with this person who is somehow or other related to that person. So that would allow an aged parent or someone like that to be included. So as a result, then both sides agreed to this, and I thought it was a marvelous compromise. It was a way to, to allow the freedom of everybody involved in it. And I just wish that the bishops had been more forthcoming in the contemporary issue that you described.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes, I certainly would agree with you too that we've been throwing around the word religious liberty with respect to the church institution and sort of neglecting the religious liberty of individuals in the conversation.
Right.
Absolutely. Turning to a different topic, in May 2005, you wrote an essay in Commonweal magazine, A Place for Dissent, My Argument with Joseph Ratzinger. And it was, as you have told us in a number of places, Joseph Ratzinger, when he was prefect of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, who in 1986 declared that, quote, one who dissents from the magisterial teaching as you do is not suitable or eligible to teach Catholic theology, end quote. In this Commonweal essay, you go on to predict that his papacy as Benedict XVI will be transitional and without major changes. You state that what we need is, quote, to reemphasize the importance of the local and national churches, the collegiality of all bishops together with the Bishop of Rome, and the role of all the baptized in the church, end quote. In this article, you express your doubt that Benedict XVI will move us in this direction, but you also wonder whether he will be less of an enforcer and more of a pastor in his role as Pope. More than 7 years have passed since Joseph Ratzinger became Benedict XVI, and of course in the past couple of weeks a large event has taken place, which is that Benedict XVI has resigned as Pope and will be stepping down shortly. So I ask you to reflect on his papacy and maybe to suggest what his legacy is going to be as Pope as he leaves the office.
Mm-hmm. Well, first of all, let me say, maybe a little bit self-triumphantly, that's one of the better prognostications I've ever made. And I think it came out really to be true, that those three things that I thought we should have, of a greater collegiality in the church, of a greater role of all the baptized, of lessening the centralization in the church, are issues that still face us very, very much today. On the other hand, I think it is true that he did try to come across primarily as a teacher and not as an enforcer. Mm-hmm. I mean, even the encyclicals he wrote, I mean, the first encyclical was on love. Well, that should be the Pope's first encyclical. You know, if you're speaking for the Christian community, this is what you should be talking about. Sure. But unfortunately, as I say, I think those other aspects were there. It does seem to me that his resignation, which I think nobody prognosticated on that one, it took everybody by surprise, I think. And in many ways, I mean, frankly, I would like to think otherwise, but I don't expect any great changes to take place with the next pontiff. Mm-hmm. After all, it's part of the same College of Bishops with the same background, more than half appointed by him, and so forth. But maybe his greatest contribution might have been in his resignation, mm-hmm. because I think there's always been a danger in the Catholic populace to look upon the Pope as almost a demigod.
Sure. And
to forget about the human aspect of it. And I think by his resignation, he has reminded everybody that of the human aspect of the papacy. The Pope is a human being, and the Catholics believe there's the help of the Holy Spirit, but you know that Catholics have always said that the divine works through the human, and if you're mentally capable and physically, then that's fine. But when you realize you're don't have that kind of stamina, that it might be time to go. And so I think he's done a marvelous thing there by indicating the humanity of the papacy. But again, and maybe to add a little bit to what I said back in 2005 or whatever you quoted, mm-hmm. That I think the one of the best articles I ever read was on this issue was a short article by the Jesuit historian John O'Malley at the turn of the millennium. And he said, what was the most significant thing that developed in the Catholic Church in the second millennium that wasn't there in the first? And his answer was the papalization of the church. That at the end of the first millennium, I forget exactly how he phrased it, but my phrase would be, you know, if 1% of Catholics in the world knew who the Pope was, that would be a large number. Mm-hmm. And we have, I mean, and again, if part of it is theology, sure, but part of it is just technology. I mean, before there was communication, transportation, to say nothing of the social media kind of thing, people didn't know who the Pope was. Right. I mean, even in the United States, in the early Roman Catholic colony in Maryland, they had the liturgy in English because they said, well, this is the new world. We do things differently here. Rome is 5 weeks away by boat, and you might get there and you might not, kind of thing. And so we have to do these things ourselves. Sure. But then I think with the technology and all types coming, that's been one of the bad effects of it, that we have really tended then to see the church primarily as the Pope. And I think that's been an unfortunate reality for the good of the church itself. Mm-hmm.
And I'm struck in particular by the contrast between the end of John Paul II's life and the end of his papacy, and then Benedict XVI's resignation, so that John Paul II took this opportunity to really make a statement about aging and end of life. And we have this contrast with Benedict XVI, who's saying, this is my time to step down and to rest and to be in prayer. So it's an interesting juxtaposition.
Right, and in one sense, I mean, there is a place for it. I mean, now, because, you know, I mean, I frankly, I would have wished that John Paul II had resigned, but nonetheless, at least he was willing to allow people to see him go downhill. Mm-hmm. I mean, slobbering at times. Yeah. I mean, you know, at least there was the willingness to let people know that we're all old, we're going to get old, and we're all going to die, and we're all going to suffer. I mean, that I think had some positive things about it. Mm-hmm. But nonetheless, I am, you know, very taken by what Benedict XVI did, and as I say, I think it might have a long-term advantage of getting people to realize that this is a very human job. Mm-hmm. I remember there was a cartoon, I think it was probably the New Yorker, it was right after the Humane Vitae crisis in '68, and inside this room it was I think the president, it might have been Adenauer in Germany, it might have been after Adenauer, I can't remember, Adenauer, de Gaulle, and I guess it was before Nixon, so it would have been Johnson. And there's a knock on the door, and they're sort of complaining among themselves about the problems, and nobody agrees with them, and what can we do? And there's a knock on the door, and de Gaulle says, oh, come in, Your Holiness, that you're going to face the same kinds of problems. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so you're right. In some way, both John Paul II and Benedict XVI have pointed out something important about our humanity and the finite nature of our humanity, but in different ways.
I think so, Elizabeth, yes.
I'd like to turn to one more topical question and then turn to your sort of concluding reflections about Christian ethics. First, though, a topic, and that is conscience. You have described conscience as, quote, what brings the subject pole and the object pole together in concrete decision-making. And I was wondering if conscience for you is only a decision-making faculty, or if there's something more to conscience, and whether limiting conscience to a decision-maker sort of keeps us in the realm of quandary ethics, which is an area that you've argued has consumed Christian ethics to the neglect of more foundational concern.
Mm-hmm. Right. No, I would think again, and again, going back to the best of the Catholic tradition with its distinction between synderesis as the habit and conscience as the act. I mean that that's right. I mean, I did say bringing the subjective aspect and the objective together, but the subjective aspect is the total person, and the subjective aspect is the formation of the total person with the virtues that go with it, with all the attitudes and dispositions that are a part of it. And therefore, this is obviously you bring all of this when you make decisions about a particular action. So that I would not want to restrict it only to the quandary ethics part, but still quandary ethics is a part of what we have to do now. And also there are other decisions that we make that might be personal quandaries. I mean, what should I do with my life? You know, should I decide to get a PhD in religious ethics? How do you make those decisions? And so we all have to make decisions, but I'd like to see it broader. One other comment, though, that I would make is I always worry about people who ultimately say that conscience is the ultimate norm and conscience trumps everything. There's some truth to that, but there's also some problems with that, and that is that conscience might be wrong. And therefore, we have to be honestly recognizing that fact, so that we have to sort of challenge ourselves always that because of that fact that conscience might be wrong. I don't want to absolutize conscience either. I see its great importance, but nonetheless, you can't absolutize conscience because it can and has been and will be in the future wrong at times.
Would you want us to follow an erroneous conscience, though, if we had done our best efforts to form and inform our conscience, if we'd really, done soul searching and consulted various sources, would we be in the right if we followed an erroneous conscience?
Well, there again, I think the old, goes back to Aquinas in my tradition, but the difference between invincible and invincible ignorance. And I also think the problem is more than ignorance today, but we'll keep it on that level. And maybe the best illustration was if a physician 30 or 40 years ago, let's say, did not diagnose somebody with AIDS. Now, obviously, that person, that physician, it did not do something wrong. Who knew what AIDS was? I mean, that person should not, she or he should not be held responsible for that decision. But today, if someone fails to diagnose AIDS, then obviously they should have known because it's obviously so well known today. So in that case, then, conscience does not excuse them, and that ignorance in their case does not excuse them. Mm-hmm. Now, historically, there has been this further question, and the further question is the action that is done out of invincible ignorance. At the very minimum, that is not a bad action. But then, and you are not culpable for it. Mm-hmm. But then there's the more positive thing. Is it a good action? Right. And there has been dispute over that. And it's interesting. I a few years ago was strongly in favor of saying it's a good action. And in one sense it is. But on the other hand, there's this poor person out there that was hurt by it. There's and you can't deny that aspect of it. Right. So again, at least it's necessary to hold on to the tension. And once again, it's that tension that you referred to earlier, the subjective pole and the objective pole. Mm-hmm. And that this person who was poorly diagnosed kind of thing, today, or even in the old days, it wasn't very good for that person. Or if the old example, the physician operates on or the surgeon operates on the wrong person or takes out the wrong part of the anatomy or something. I noticed, a year ago when I had cataracts, they put a big thing on my eye to show which eye they had to go into, kind of thing. But, I mean, if they make a mistake, it might not necessarily be their fault, but it would certainly affect the person involved. So
Sure, sure.
at least you have to hold on to both of those things.
Right. You can never forget about the wrong that is done,
Right.
even if conscience is operating under the best of
In the best of
circumstances.
circumstances.
Yeah. So you would want to hold on to a sort of qualified primacy of conscience.
I think that would be a good way to phrase it.
Mhm.
I might use that sometime.
I worry myself that conscience today, that word is thrown around to make a lot of excuses, and that people misunderstand what conscience is, and so use it to justify any kind of behavior.
Right.
I followed my conscience
Right.
without truly understanding what that means. Um, in closing, I'd like to reflect with you a little bit about your own positions in Christian ethics, how your own ethical thinking has changed over the years, and also what has remained the same in your ethical thinking, and what you think or hope your greatest contribution to the field of Christian ethics has been thus far.
Maybe I just lasted a long time. Longevity might be the response to that one, Elizabeth. Uh,
No, there must
and
be more than that.
I think what I was able to do early on, especially, was to bring together Roman Catholic and Protestant ethics. That this was a great opportunity that I think we had, especially in the United States, and I personally profited very much from it. That that the leading figures in Protestant ethics in the United States in the 60s were very open to dialogue with Roman Catholics, even though there wasn't much going on. I mean, someone like Jim Gustafson had read Herring in German. Uh, Professor Lehmann had read Herring and Gilliman and a few others, as Augustus had read them too. Paul Ramsey had worked with the principle of double effect. So there was a real openness on the part of the major Protestant officials in the United States to dialogue with Roman Catholics. And I found that to be a very invigorating thing. I mean, I read the Niebuhrs, I got into them, and I thought I could try to bring together the best of the two traditions, kind of thing, holding on to my own Roman Catholic background, but certainly learning an awful lot from the traditional Protestant dimension of things. And I think, again, that has sort of set a trajectory for what I have tried to do, is to have that kind of approach to things. And that maybe in the last analysis, that might be the primary thing. Frankly, I mean, there's no doubt that the quandary ethics at times has taken over a more important role than it should. Now, that was especially part of the Roman Catholic thing after Humanae Vitae in 1968, the Pope Paul VI encyclical reiterating the Catholic condemnation of artificial contraception for spouses. And obviously any Roman Catholic theologian had to deal with that. And then all the consequences of that. I mean, that affected your whole understanding of sexuality. You had to change your approach. And as we all know, this has been a very difficult area in Roman Catholicism. The hierarchical magisterium is unwilling to change. And many Roman Catholic moral theologians have argued we have to really have a better understanding of sexuality than we have. So in a sense, I guess that too, I was sort of caught in the historical trap of Vatican II on the one hand, with its attempt to renew moral theology. I mean, to bring in the scripture, to bring in the liturgy, to bring in the call of Vatican II that all Christians are called to perfection, and that moral theology is just can't deal with the basic minimum, and we had to do much more than quandary ethic. But then we got this other historical circumstance came along, and that had to be dealt with as well. So that, and I guess in one sense, that's the nature of the beast. I mean, that's who we are. We don't live in a vacuum. We're dealing with the historical circumstances as they come along, and we're obviously going to be colored by those kinds of things. And, I'm sure there are all sorts of historical circumstances in the future that are going to influence the trajectory that you're going to give us.
Mm-hmm. Which leads into my final question. In what direction would you like to see the field of Christian ethics move in the 21st century? You've mentioned a need for more attention to church in conversation with ethics. Anything else that you'd like to see characterize the field in the coming years?
Well, I think certainly, again, to continue some of those trajectories that we talked about earlier. And again, the greater specialization. I guess one other small, well, maybe not so small point. I guess I'd call it more a worry at the present time. I have expressed my great appreciation for what the academic nature of the discipline has done to the growth of Christian ethics. Without that, I mean, it was the academic nature that, seminary professors back in the 60s didn't have to publish in order to keep their jobs. Mm-hmm. I mean, I'm not making publishing, the be all and end all, but it's a necessary part of what we all do. And I think that's very significant and has done a great deal to help the discipline. But now I worry a little bit about the fact that the criteria for promotion in the college and university at time might not give enough importance to the theological nature of the discipline. And it seems to me that we might lose out on that aspect. So that's a warning, I guess, that I would give to the future. I would like to make sure that we don't lose that, because I'm a little bit afraid at times that the criteria of academic advancement in the university does not give enough importance to the specifically distinctive and unique theological aspects of our discipline.
Mm-hmm. Well, I thank you for your time today. We've all benefited greatly from your work as a mediating thinker and your efforts at synthesis, as you described. So I appreciate you talking with us today. It's been very enjoyable to have this conversation with you.
Well, Elizabeth, thank you very much. And I appreciate all the work that you put into it. You did more work for this one than I did.
I'm glad we could finally connect.
Finally. Better late than never.
Yes.